Hey, what's up, space travelers? Welcome to the Exoplanet Zoom to the Surface tutorial from the Space VFX Element series by Adi Burrows and me, Gleb Alexandrov. So in the previous tutorials, we learned how to deal with the Micropolygon Displacement. Now it's time to put these ideas into practice and create an awesome exoplanet. This is very exciting, but if you try to reproduce it, you may get this error. This is no good. It means that you don't have enough video memory. We'll deal with it. First, let's create a sphere and displace it, because this tutorial is about displacement as well. Here is a cube. Now we go to the edit mode and subdivide smooth. Press W to invoke this menu, subdivide smooth again. Shift R to repeat this operation a few times until we get the smooth sphere out of the cube. Now press T and select smooth to get rid of the faceted look. The next step would be to create a new material and call it accordingly. I always call things as they are. Planet is planet. Stupid simple. I've also set up these two directional lights and I'm gonna enter the rendered mode. So the basic setup is nothing too fancy, just a sphere, two lights, a camera, and now let's maybe assign a more darker color to our material and go to the render settings, set the feature set to experimental. Also take a look at this subdivision rate. It's set to 5 right now. We can set it a bit lower to create a higher quality displacement, but right now I will keep it at 5 and add the subdivision surface modifier, enable the adaptive checkbox to enable micropolygon rendering. And back to the material settings, let's set the displacement method to true. This will allow us to manipulate the displacement straight out of the material settings, out of the node editor, I should say. So I'm gonna come over to the node editor. Now we have this diffuse shader. What I'm going to do is add the image texture by pressing Shift A, selecting texture, image texture. I love these simple steps, they are so easy to explain. And now I clicked open and clicked this icon to preview the textures. We have two textures here. That is a seamless kind of a moon surface texture that we're going to use for displacement. Let's click open image. And to preview just this texture, we can Control Shift and click on it. But you have to have the node Wrangler Done enabled. And after that, I'm going to add the input texture coordinate node and connect the generated output over here into the vector input. Let's switch over to the box projection mode. That will mean that our texture will be projected from different sides at once. And let's adjust this blend parameter to hide the seam between these projections. And I'm going to add the mapping node as well to be able to control the location of the texture. We can click and drag the location to slide it, or we can click and drag down, then drag right, or just set the value to tweak the scale. I'm going to leave the scale at 1 and add yet another thing, but first, let's tidy things up. Let's add the layout frame. Position it over here. Adjust the borders of the frame so it encompasses these nodes. And by pressing N, you can open the right tool shelf. Add the label. I just added texture 1. Set the label size to 60 to make it more readable. And press N to close this menu. In a second, I'm going to plug this into the displacement socket. But for now, let's add the math node, because we probably want to multiply this by some value to make the displacement stronger. So let's set it to multiply. And let's set the value to 1 for now. And of course, let's plug it into the displacement. To actually see the effect, we have to select the object and hit Tab twice. And straight out of the box, the displacement effect looks cool. And the point of the adaptive tessellation is that we zoom in and the resolution updates as we refresh the displacement and all that stuff. We can call it different words: adaptive subdivision, tessellation, micropolygon rendering. What we can do now is tweak the strength of the displacement. But I think that 2 is too much. I'm going to leave it at 1. And let's now create a color map. What I want to do is introduce yet another texture to the mix. So I'm going to duplicate these nodes by selecting it and clicking Shift D. Now let's change the label, to not get confused. Now let's click this open icon and navigate to the folder with the textures and select the second texture, Lunar Bump. Seamless texture also. Of course, we can use this texture number 1, but I decided to make yet another texture to add some variation. Variation is cool. So let's add the mix RGB node because we want to mix these two set of nodes together. Let's plug it into the second socket, and this one should go into the first one. Hold Ctrl Shift and click on this node to preview it, and we can interpolate between 0 and 1 to kind of mix these two textures together. Let's set it to add instead. This means that the second input will make the first input brighter. So I've set the value to 0.7 to add the large chunk of the second texture to the first one. And also let's add the color ramp node, because chances are that we would like to tweak the contrast of this whole thing. So now I'm plugging it back into the color socket of the diffuse shader. Now the magical trick will happen. I will press Shift P to draw the frame around this node of camera and also label it color. And Ctrl Shift and click on this diffuse shader to preview the whole thing. First of all, I want to select the right flag and make it a lot darker. And kind of increase the contrast by moving the flags closer to the center. You can see how this cool little trick helps us to separate the shapes and so on. Now let's hold Ctrl and click on this line to create additional flags. We can select the colors for each individual flag. For example, let's make this one brighter, add yet another one, make it darker and position it like this. All of this shenanigans to add the separation between the shapes and ultimately to add visual interest. Ta-da! Point number 3, add a bump map. After we added the color ramp, it's time to add the bump map. So first, let's crank up the scale of this texture to really add the details. And maybe I want to slightly tweak the color map. Just a little bit of tweaking. Okay, maybe it wasn't necessary. Let's add the bump node. Drag this into the height socket. And the normal output should go over there. If the effect is not prominent enough, you can try pressing M while selecting the bump node to disable it and enable it back. This will make the change really obvious. But you know what, let's make it even more obvious by increasing the distance to 0.2. And at any time you can return and, for example, tweak the location of the textures, something like that. A creative process is a non-linear process. You can go back, you can reiterate for this whole thing. It can go on and on and on and on forever. Okay, after we have finished with the basic bump map, we can start adding procedural details to it. This will be a nice bonus to the image textures. So let's start by adding the mix RGB node. Hit Ctrl Shift and click on it to preview. Okay, let's grab this node by pressing B for selection rectangle and moving it down by pressing G, just to give ourselves an additional space. And let's start the ball rolling by creating the noise texture, plugging it into the second socket of the mix RGB node. And right away, let's add the color ramp node because we want to tweak it. Grab the left flag and move it to the right, and this one to the left. That will boost the contrast. Now we can play with the scale to make it more detailed. And also, let's set the details to 8. This is as far as I can tell, and 80 agrees with me. The maximum you can get out of the details from the noise texture. So let's set the mix factor to 1 to just preview the noise. And by holding Ctrl and clicking on the line, I'm adding the new flags. And the whole point of playing with the color ramp is to bring up not so obvious details that is hiding in the noise. And we make it prominent by adjusting the contrast, shifting the values in the middle of the color ramp and other stuff. So let's get back to the diffuse shader preview. And also I'm gonna adjust the distance of the bump and set it to 0.4. And create yet another mix RGB. Copy this noise texture, plug it into the second socket. See, we are repeating ourselves. We even gonna add the color ramp and tweak the contrast. Deja vu. But this time we will set the scale to something like 25. This will really crank up the resolution of the noise, but add the unwanted repetition as well. We need to counteract it by duplicating these nodes and plugging it into the mix factor. Also, we have to change the scale. Let's set it to 15, for example, and that means that we'll mix this previous noise texture with this noise texture by another noise texture, a lot of noise. But it all makes sense in the end when you zoom in to the surface and you see these additional details popping out. That's totally worth the effort of setting this thing up. Now what you can do to make it a little bit more clean is hit B, draw the selection rectangle around these nodes, grab it and move it over here, and then press Ctrl G to put these nodes into the group. And now we can tab out of this group and rename it. And you can anytime press tab to enter this group, change some things, tab to exit it. Alright, fine. The next step would be to add the distance-based micro details. Because if we want to move really close to the surface, the noise group will help a little bit, but still we'll notice a lack of details. So in our hierarchy of details, the noise group is kind of a medium scale thing. We need a finer one. And actually, to avoid too much clutter and noise, we're gonna reveal these details only when the camera is really close to the surface. We can do it by using the distance from the camera, but first, let's add the mix RGB node. Press B to draw the selection rectangle and select this texture 2 nodes. Press Shift D to duplicate, move it over here. Or on the second thought, I decided to arrange these nodes a little bit differently, so let's move it over here. And select all of this, press G to grab, and drag this output over here. That will be our finer grain of the material. And let's set it to add. We don't want to replace the previous texture. We want to add this one on top of everything else. Now I'm really cranking up the scale of this texture to something like 25. And you can imagine if we zoom out from this planet, we'll see that this scale looks awful from the distance. So we have to reveal it only as we're getting closer to the surface. Let's go Shift A, input camera data. What we'll do now is use the view Z depth as a guide for this effect. Let's plug it into the mix factor. Go Shift A, color ramp. One of the best nodes ever. Sometimes I have a feeling that we can do anything using the color ramp. But first let's switch to B-spline mode to create slightly more gradual transition from black to white. See, now we can reveal the details, but it's a wrong direction, so let's hit this arrows button and drag the right slider. Now we can see how this texture layer slowly fades away as it gets farther from the camera. We can also try tweaking the color of the left flag. Click on it and make it darker. This, I would say, would decrease the overall strength of the effect, but I'm gonna set it to something like medium gray. And look at this, I'm going to zoom out, and you will see that these details disappear. Let's drag the selection rectangle around these nodes, press Shift P. Obviously, I paused the video, named the labels, and resumed it. Let's take a look at how the microstructure fades into view. That looks awesome. Now let's take a look how it would look without these effects. So this is only noise. Now this is no tricks whatsoever, and it looks like we are playing Doom, the 1993 version, and we walked straight into the wall. No good. Now let's make a cool shader. Now you may be thinking, but what is cool? What do you mean by cool? Because cool is a subjective characteristic. The connotations of this word are unstable, and it's based on personal preference, blah blah blah. But you know what? Let's add the mix shader. Then I'm gonna add the glossy shader as well. Drag it over here. Now what we can do is press Shift A, go input, and add the Fresnel node. This will make the material more reflective on a glancing angle. And because we have set up the bump map, let's connect it to the Fresnel node and to the glossy shader as well. It's crucial to not forget to plug it into the normal input of the Fresnel, because I always forget to do it. See, now it looks like a ball of goo. It's so cool. I can't believe we reached this point. Now let's try to turn it into a planet. First, let's lower the distance of the bump effect. I'm going to set it to 0.1 or maybe slightly higher. 0.2 will work well. And let's also take down the strength a bit, because very strong bump effect reduces the visual scale of the planet. If the details are prominent, if the details are big, then the planet is small. That totally makes sense. And if you want to control the reflectivity, we can add the mix RGB node right after the Fresnel node. Then take this output and plug it into the color ramp. And zoom in and plug this color ramp into the second socket of the mix shader. What we're gonna do is set the mix factor to 1 and set the mix mode to multiply. In other words, we'll take the Fresnel node and make it darker using this texture. And also let's Ctrl Shift and click on this node to preview just this bunch of nodes. And see how these two layers interact with each other? We can make it even more extreme by pushing this left flag to the right and also squeezing the range. That will look good, I think. Let's now select these nodes, press Shift P to put them into a frame, and return to previewing the whole material by Ctrl Shift clicking on the mix shader. Now this looks a little bit more like a planet, agree? So what we just did is created a couple of levels of details, including these micro details that appear as we zoom in. If you got Space VFX elements in the resources folder, you can find this file and see for yourself how it was built. Alright folks, let's try to zoom in right to these craters. So we can hit tab twice to refresh the displacement and continue our movement. You can already see that while we're getting closer, the new layers of information arise. This technique obviously has its limits, but to a certain degree it works perfectly. Ultimately, it depends on how much time you want to spend setting up the new layers of details. Anyway, the potential is huge. Now you may ask, what will happen if I zoom in and render? Well, this is micropolygon rendering, and right now in Blender 2.78, the whole object is being tessellated or subdivided. Even if you see just a chunk of this object, what we can do is use the optimization which will hide what camera doesn't see. So let's try setting the subdivision rate as well as the preview rate to 1 and hit render. And you will see this dreadful error. As I've said, it means that your video card doesn't have enough video memory. So let's go ahead and build our own view Frustum Culling. Basically, that's an optimization that is often used in games. So first I'm going to create a plane. Now shift and select this camera object, press Ctrl C and select copy location. And Ctrl C again and copy rotation. And one quick note, you need to have the copy attributes add-on enabled to do this. Alright, I'm pressing S and Y 2 times to scale this plane on the local Y axis. I made this rectangle which mimics the aspect ratio of the render, which is 1920 by 1080 pixels. So I scaled it down. And let's add the array modifier now. Turn off the relative offset and turn on the constant offset instead. Now we can tweak the Z value. And see, there are 2 rectangles now. What we can do now is turn on the fade length and increase the length. Set this as high as you need, because everything that falls out outside this range will just disappear later on. For now I'm going to set it to 100 and decrease the Z to be something like -0.5. Your array modifier may span in different direction, so you may use positive Z direction instead of the negative one. Okay, and I've also added the simple deform modifier, set it to taper, and now we can tweak the taper factor. And as soon as we hit the limit, we can just click and type in -20, for example. What I want to do here is align the width of the array with the camera view. So I'm scaling it here on the local Y-axis a bit. That looks okay. And also we can just increase the taper factor further, set to -30, and tweak it so it encompasses the camera view. In the object settings, we can set the maximum draw type to wire, to make it invisible in the camera view. Next, I'll select this array, shift and select the camera, press Ctrl P and set parent to object. That means that if I move the camera, this object will move with the camera. Finally, let's make this object invisible in the cycles rendering as well. Select this, go to Array Visibility tab and uncheck these checkboxes. Alright, the next step would be to select this planet, go to the Modifiers tab, and add the new modifier Vertex Weight Proximity. Now we need to create vertex group to use with this modifier. Go to this tab, hit plus, name the vertex group however you want. Now we need to assign the vertices to this group. So I'm going to hit tab to enter the edit mode, press A to select every vertex, set the weight all the way to 0, and click assign. That will assign the weight of 0 to every vertex. And back to the modifiers tab in the vertex group drop-down menu, I'm selecting this vertex group _01. And to make it even more convenient, I'm going to select the array, go to the object tab and rename it. Right, fine. What I will do is select the planet, come over to the modifiers. Now click on this picker icon and pick the mask object. After that, we just have to set the distance to geometry. We can use vertices, edges or faces. I prefer to use faces. And let's set the lowest and the highest numbers to 1. Now if you come over to the weight paint mode, you'll notice how this mask object affects the vertex weight of the sphere. But we have to place this modifier at the top of the modifier stack to make it work correctly. And now we see the transition from vertex weight 0 to vertex weight 1. And if you move the camera, the vertex weight will update. Isn't it beautiful? The idea behind this, once again, is that we align this mask object with the camera frustum, which is the area that camera sees. And the final step for this particular stage of the setup is go to the object mode, collapse these things, and add a new modifier. This will be the mask modifier. And in the vertex group, click and select vertex group _01. Now what we can do is click this arrow icon to invert the effect. And that's what we need. Now we can move subsurf to the bottom of the modifier stack, and we are good to go. Now let's implement an occlusion culling. So we have set up the camera view culling, but what happens on the other side of the planet? It should be hidden too. But first let's subdivide this sphere again, because I think we could use a little bit more high resolution stuff. Go to this tab and hit assign with all vertices selected. And now we have the more high-res edges, which is good. We can now select this mask object, press M, and move it to layer number 2. It will still be active even on layer number 2, but it will clean up the viewport for us. You can now just grab the camera by pressing G, move it around, and see how the camera culling that we have set up works. I bet that in the future versions of Blender it will be an automatic process, but meanwhile we can set up it ourselves. Okay, the next thing would be to select this object, hit Shift S and select cursor to select it. And that will place the cursor at the center of the object. Now add a cube, press S to scale it up, and then X to constrain it to the X-axis, for example. And then I'm gonna scale it on the Z-axis as well, and maybe a little bit on the Y-axis, and move it to the left like this. This will be our next mask object that we'll use with the mask modifier. So let's type in something like mask _ back, set the maximum draw type to wire, and in the cycle settings, uncheck these checkboxes. Once again, let's select the planet, hit Shift S and cursor to select it. Now select this cube, press Ctrl Alt Shift C, and set origin to 3D cursor. Now, if you press R to rotate the object, it will rotate around the center of the planet. What we need to do now is constrain it to the camera rotation. So, add object constraint, copy rotation, and click on this picker, and select the camera. Ooh, but now we did something terribly wrong. To fix it, let's go to the object mode, press R and X to rotate it on the X-axis, and type -90. That will rotate it on the X-axis by -90 degrees. And I also moved it so it cuts the object in half. And now this mask object should inherit the rotation of the camera. But we still have to set up the modifiers. It will be pretty much the same steps, so go to the modifiers tab and copy this vertex weight proximity modifier. Move it down below. What else we can do now is add yet another vertex group. So go to this object data tab, hit plus, and type in vertex _group _02. Select all vertices and press assign. And take a note that weight is set to 0. Now go back over to the modifiers tab. Remove this vertex group 01 and select vertex group 02 instead in the second vertex weight proximity modifier, and pick this cube as a mask object. And I'm also going to set the proximity mode to object this time. Finally, let's copy the mask modifier and move it down like this. And let's just replace the vertex group with the second one, and that should conclude this setup. But I think I made a mistake, I'm sorry. The distance should be set to geometry, not to the object. So let's also set the lowest and the highest value to something like 1, for example. Now we just have to select this cube object, press tab. Now hit Ctrl R and use the mouse wheel to create the additional edge loops. Then we can just left click and hit F to create the faces out of these edge loops. So this new geometry is serving as a mask. Now we can fine tune the lowest and the highest value to not cut away the unneeded portion of the sphere. That looks good to me. Let's now recap the steps quickly. We created the view Frustum culling, and then we implemented a kind of an occlusion culling, which should work pretty efficiently with this spherical object. And you can try and move the camera, rotate it around the object. or just press Shift F to go into the first person mode and move around the planet. After that, just select the object, press M, and move it to layer number 2. We don't have to see this stuff. It would be better if it worked like magic. And now, ladies and gentlemen, not enough memory error should be completely gone. I'm going to come over to the camera settings and set the alpha to 1 to just see what camera sees. And it's so cool that we can test it just by clicking Shift F to go into the first person mode and use WASD keys to navigate. And I feel that the viewport is still a little bit slow, so I'm going to set the subdivision rate to 5. Hit Shift F again, and now it should be more responsive. And we can zoom in really closely. The cool thing about this optimization shenanigans that we went through is that now we can use the displacement to its full potential. For example, hover the camera just above the surface and see these beautiful details, these variations of depth. Maybe you would be able to see the xenomorph eggs, like the Easter xenomorph eggs. Alright guys, before we call it a day, we can just do one more thing, animate the camera. What I'm going to do is create a curve, and then just animate the camera along this curve. So press Shift A, curve, Bezier. Let's scale it up, and press G to move it over here. You can press Tab to enter the edit mode. What we'll do here is create a zoom in animation, which follows this curvy path. So first the camera will approach the planet, and by the way we can scale these points like this, and extrude it by pressing the E key. So after the camera approaches the planet, it starts orbiting around the planet. That would be cool, just like it's influenced by gravitation. Next I'm gonna come over to the curves tab and crank up the resolution. Let's set it to 64, because if we don't do it, the camera move will feel a bit bumpy. So let's select the camera, then right click and select the curve, then go Ctrl P and follow path. That will make the camera align to the path. Actually, let's test it out. First, let's open the timeline panel. Now we can click and drag and watch the animation. So Houston, we have a problem here. The camera starts animating from this point instead of the starting point as we intended it. So we can hit Tab to enter the edit mode, press B and grab all these handles, then go W and switch direction. That will fix the starting point problem, but we still have to position the camera at the beginning of the curve. So press G and just manually position it like this, starting at the beginning of the curve. Now we can go to the curve settings and disable this follow checkbox. That means that we will be setting the rotation manually. So let's press R 2 times to rotate the camera like this. And we can even hover the mouse over the viewport. Press R 2 times to kind of look around. Alright, let's take a look at the overall length of the animation and some other settings. Select the curve. So let's set the frame number to 400 first. And then go to path animation settings and set the number of frames. I think that even 300 will be enough. And after that, it will just stop and we'll watch the xenomorph eggs hatching. Okay, if we now press Alt A, we can preview the animation, and of course we still have to set up the camera rotation after that. Okay, what we can do is return to frame number 0, or just hit Shift and left arrow, then press Alt A to start the animation. And maybe at frame 100, let's set up a different keyframe for the rotation. We can hit I and insert the new keyframe for the rotation. Then we can jump to frame 200 and insert yet another keyframe. Double tap R in the viewport to look around. That will look fantastic. I already feel it. So hit I, insert the new keyframe for the rotation. And now let's scrub to frame 250, because the closer we get to the planet, the faster we move in relationship to a planet. And that means that we need more keyframes. So press I, select rotation, and repeat these steps until you basically create the whole animation. Just double tap R to look around, then press I, and insert the rotation keyframe. To preview the animation, just hit Alt A. I think we reached the point when it looks really awesome, even before rendering. Now we are talking. That's visual effects. Very exciting. And finally, before we can call it a day, we just have to render it out. Now this shouldn't be much of a problem, because we have set up this optimization thing, which involves the camera view culling and the occlusion culling. Now we can just come over to the render settings, check the resolution, check the subdivision rate. I think that for the preview render, we can leave it at 5, just to check the intermediate result. Let's set the format of the preview animation to H264. And also I'd like to keep a number of samples pretty low, so let's go to the samples tab and set it to something like 30 or maybe 50. And a cool little touch to this Space VFX animation would be to enable the motion blur. Now it's just a matter of setting the output file. Go to the output, click on this icon, and here is my file name, Planet Zoom Super Epic, and some exclamation marks, or just random letters, as if it somehow enhances the epicness of the video. So before rendering, I set the resolution to 50% to get shorter render time. And that pretty much concludes the Exoplanet Zoom tutorial from the Space VFX series by Eddie Burrows from CG Masters and me, Gleb Alexander from Creative Shrimp. If you enjoyed this tutorial, I'm sure you will enjoy the full video course. Check it out on creativeshrimp.com and cgmasters.net. If you want to explore the project files and textures and all that stuff, it is indeed included in the full version of the course. Press thumbs up, thanks for watching and see you.